Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. This week, rather than focus on a specific region of the world where the U.S. is throwing its weight around, I will be talking about the reasons behind U.S. aggression in the world and the ways that behavior affects those of us who are trying to stop it here in this country. My guest this week is Monisha Rios. I asked Monisha to introduce herself to the Wider View audience.
So, hi everybody. My name is Monisha Rios. I'm a U.S. Army veteran from the Persian Gulf era. I'm also in the diaspora of the Puerto Rican, Vieque. So that means that I'm Puerto Rican. We have a beautiful blend of cultures there. Let's see what else. I'm also working on a PhD in liberation psychology, specializing in transformative social change, starting my dissertation research now, my proposal now. And I'm looking specifically at the role of the U.S. military psychological industrial complex in neocolonialism and the growth of the U.S. empire. And I'm viewing it through my eyes as a Puerto Rican woman veteran, specifically looking at how I experienced the moral injury of what I've learned in relationship to having been in the U.S. military.
Yeah, I got to know about you through Veterans of Peace, and you were at one point a national board member of Veterans for Peace. Maybe you can tell us what got you interested in the peace movement to begin with.
Sure. Thank you. It's a great question. So I got started off in activism through the military sexual trauma survivor movement. So for 30 plus years, various people who had been impacted by sexual violence in the military came together and tried to get the laws changed to make the military safer, because, you know, the rates that you hear about with that are really low in comparison to the reality. Not everything has been reported, but it's pretty brutal and pretty sadistic what happens. And so through this movement, I met another woman veteran, a Somalia combat vet, who is a member of Veterans for Peace. And she started telling me more and more about it. And during one of our actions in DC, she finally reeled me in. and then I joined. And then that's where I really found my peace education at the same time that I was getting peace education through my university program. So that's how I came to be with Veterans for Peace.
One thing that I've noticed about the peace movement is that it seems to have diminished in size and in strength, really, over the last few decades. And every time I go to any kind of peace group, it's sort of dominated by older activists who got their start, you know, in the anti-Vietnam protests, probably back in the 60s. And how do you think existing peace organizations like Veterans for Peace and others can attract younger people, you know, newer veterans into the movement? And secondarily, how do you think they can become more effective in their work?
Well, to answer the first part, which I'm really loving these questions, and thank you for asking them. They need to be asked. I think as far as attracting a more vast array of movers to the movement, the people who have been dominating it for so long can learn how to listen better and step back. Learn that things do need to change, accept that things do need to change, and then, you know, open up and embrace being part of that change, and learning that, you know, as we go through life, our roles in the world also change. And so, you know, to the elders who have been in the movement for as long as they have and had so many experiences that we can all learn from together, also don't use age as a weapon. Don't assume that your chronological age equates to wisdom, or being worshipped. admit that you can do wrong. Just because you've
Right.
been in the movement for so long doesn't mean you know everything either. So then also, it would be really attractive for that openness to be palpable, to be apparent, to be felt, because people coming into the peace movement and, specifically the veterans peace movement also have experience that you don't have. So then, take on that role of teacher and learner. And I think that would make a big difference, because then they can also learn how maybe they are upholding white supremacy or practicing it unconsciously and causing harm to communities that, they're really wanting to ally with and be in solidarity with. And so I guess this is answering both questions at the same time in terms of becoming more effective. All this work needs to be done, but also it's important to remember that you are not the center of the universe, and the American peace movement is not the center of the universe. That this is global, and we need to learn how to play well with others, and stop with the American centrism that exists in the peace movement too. Make room, learn when to be quiet, learn when to listen and learn when to lift others up. It doesn't always have to be you. So, and also that the envisioning of peace and the acting out of the peace movement thus far has been centered on the perspectives of white males, ultimately, and women. Multiple people from different walks have had to struggle to have a voice in that, to help broaden the definition of peace and help broaden the concept of how we can achieve it. Because everyone, it's like the allegory of the elephant. You see the image where everyone's blind and they're just touching the part that's right in front of them and saying, "This is the whole thing." Right. So,
well, it's interesting. Let me sort of push on that a little bit, because I have some friends who would say, for example, that an organization like Veterans for Peace should focus on being anti-war and not get themselves diverted, I think might be a term they'd use, into struggles about race or gender or what have you. So they want to sort of push those aside and sort of go in one direction. How would you respond to that?
Bluntly.
I thought so.
And respectfully. I mean, we all have different levels of awareness and understanding of complex systems, right? And if we view war, or what people view as war, as particularly those who push back against the rest of us who say, no, this is much broader, their view is very small. It's very pinpointed, right? So just like the elephant, they're looking at the face and they're not seeing the rest of the body. And so with that, I think it would be really helpful for them to maybe start questioning themselves on that. Like, where does that perception come from? Where does that feeling really come from? Does it come from a very solid analysis of war and how war works and why war is? And if so, then let's talk about the analysis of the situation. Let's talk about the reality and the material aspects of the situation. And then we can see objectively what's happening, instead of what is really an ignorant assumption of what war is from a very limited perspective. And so it's important to look at race, gender, class, actually really primarily class and capitalism, and how race and gender dynamics fit into service of capitalism, and how war is a tool of the capitalist class. And then we can have the conversation.
That's a very good analysis. I think another way of looking at it, which I assume you've done quite a bit of work on, is through the lens of colonialism. I saw a definition, which I got from you actually, of colonialism as the act of a state enforcing its rule over other nations or territories through political, economic, military, or social means. And I think most of us aren't really taught the history of the United States. We see the U.S. as having rebelled against the colonial power rather than having been the colonial power. And so we don't really see what we're doing in the world as a colonial activity. So maybe you can talk a little bit about all that and where we should be going.
I didn't always view it in the way I view it now either. I mean, when I joined the military, I joined, we're the good guys, we can do no wrong. And I reeled against peace activists who pointed out the fact that we don't actually do all right. And so I really empathize with that position. And the thing that has made the difference for me in terms of not just becoming a better worker in the peace movement, and hopefully a more effective, really has helped me develop politically and helped me develop as a human being in the world, is unlearning the history that we've been taught. So making a conscious effort to unlearn it. Don't just read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Also read an Indigenous People's History of the United States, an African American and Latinx history of the United States, and a disability history of the United States, because this really helps paint a larger picture. And I have a ton of books that I could recommend people to help with the unlearning process and then the learning new. So especially in terms of viewing the United States as a colonial power, there's a lot of humanness to sift through to get to that, right? Our denial, how that feels to us, to suddenly realize, oh, I'm benefiting from settler colonialism.
Right.
And I think once people allow themselves to start seeing that truth and not just seeing the truth from their own eyes, but seeing it from other people who have a different experience of the United States than they do, then that will help develop them into more accurate action. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Well, to some extent, yeah.
Okay.
Because I think one of the things that always strikes me about this argument is the idea that we've got to do something because of our values as a nation or as a people. This, of course, seems to me to come from a lack of understanding of what our values really are. We are, by attacking all these countries and, bombing the hell out of them, acting on our values.
Yes.
In a real way. I mean, not the values we'd like to be proud of, perhaps. But would you agree with that?
Yes. And that really illustrates for me. You see a lot of people, especially nowadays, asking, how did we get here? How did we become this way? And really the answer is we already were from the beginning, by design. This is who we are. These, like you said, these are also our values. And by going back and learning the real history from, all the perspectives of the people who were on the receiving end of our, our theft, my people included, then that's when hopefully people understand that, no, this is our character as an empire, even to say that we are a nation. Yes, that's true. That's not the whole truth, though. We are a nation that is an empire that was built through settler colonialism. Then again, also it's helpful to look at why. Why was that happening? What is the nature of the character of the people who were leading this expansion, who were choosing to conquer and invade?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the places that I see kind of as a case study in this right now is the other major settler colonial power in the world, which is Israel. And what we see, as we look at it, are the people in Israel becoming further and further reactionary, becoming more racist. Settlers, particularly in the occupied territories, just committing murder and tearing down people's olive trees and homes and being as brutal as we were to the Native Americans, at a similar point in our history. So we really can see that settler colonialism isn't just something that happens to the other, it also happens to the colonial power itself. It also has an effect on us.
Absolutely. Just like the invention of whiteness, that was done in service to settler colonialism in the US. I would be curious what parallels there are in terms of how the Israeli people who are doing these atrocities are how are they thinking about this? How are they feeling about this? What is going on for them that they feel like they have the right to do this? Mm-hmm. What has been invented? What stories and narratives are they believing about themselves and others? And mm-hmm. Will they understand the harm they're also causing themselves in doing this to their relatives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Abby Martin has done some good work on this. When I post this interview, I will also put a link to Abby's interview because she interviewed a number of Israeli citizens about just this sort of thing, in her recent trip over there. So that'll be interesting. You're listening to activist and scholar Monisha Rios, and this is Wider View. You can find links to the Abby Martin video we're discussing and relevant books and articles in the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com. Let me switch a little bit. We talked about settler colonialism, but we also need to talk about invasion colonialism. And we have a number of colonies still in the United States that I think most of us don't really think of, or if we think of them, we don't really think of them as colonies. Guam, American Samoa, the Marshall Islands, and of course, Puerto Rico. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that status is for the people who are in these colonies and what that's doing to them and to us.
The status I'm most familiar with, obviously, is Puerto Rico. I'm not sure what arrangements the other colonies have with the U.S. Mm-hmm. With Puerto Rico, currently, we're called a Commonwealth and a freely associated state. And I can't remember the exact year. It was the early 50s that we entered this status. Right before that, we were considered a colony. But colonization was that type of colonization was becoming unfashionable in the world, right, as well. So, to be a good empire, they had to sort of succumb to a little pressure. And so what that means is we are not considered, we're basically just property of the United States. And we're not considered full citizens on the island where you have certain access to the same benefits that full citizens on the mainland have. So being that my dad came to the continental U.S. and I was born here and raised here, I have more rights than my relatives, aunts and uncles, cousins do who live in Puerto Rico, in the three islands that make up Puerto Rico. So there's that weirdness. When the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico under the guise of liberating us from Spain, the promise was to vote on independence, to basically honor what the consensus was among the elected assembly of Puerto Rico at the time was for independence. However, the United States invaded specifically for the military value of the land, as well as the sugar industry. So we essentially are hostages who have something like Stockholm syndrome with our conquerors. We fear our own sovereignty. We fear our own independence. We fear our ability to make our own way in the world because the narrative that is consistently fed us by our captors is that. Mm-hmm. And then what strikes me about non-Puerto Rican U.S. citizens who especially lately just have no filter, don't even hide their hatred of Puerto Ricans or their dehumanization of us and their absolute disregard for our land, the health of it, as just not only ignorance of what the U.S. has done to destroy us, our culture, and our land, but that it's the right thing to do. That they own us. People have literally said we own you for a reason. And there's no awareness of how, in Vieques alone, because the Navy expropriated the majority of the island of Vieques to create a bombing range that was used over 60 years by multiple countries for war games, what that is still doing to us. The pollution that's there, the contaminants that are there, that it's a Superfund site, that 295 rounds of depleted uranium were accidentally, in quotes, dropped. People have died. People have cancers that are rare and more highly concentrated in that region. So they don't understand that, and then they don't use that as a reflection of what's happening on the continental U.S. with all the pollution. I mean, look at the downwinders. Look at what happens with all the tests that led up to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Look at the water pollution. Mm-hmm. Look at everything that happens around a base on the continental U.S. and you see the parallels. But yet there's that dividing factor that keeps us from seeing each other as people and uniting against this.
Right. And I think we get a good impression of how the U.S. government particularly feels about Puerto Rico as a result of the response to the hurricanes a few years ago, in which basically nothing was done, as I understand it, to help the people. Whereas, of course, if it had hit someplace, a little whiter, things might have been different.
Yeah.
Well, let's circle back to where your work is, and that's I guess neocolonialism. We'll go to not the last form, but one of the other forms of colonialism. And I think, as you correctly brought out, I mean, this is a function of capitalism. Our interventions around the world are not on behalf of the interests of the American people, but on the interests of a very small minority who hold all the wealth. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your work on neocolonialism and where you're going with that.
Sure. So I'm still building my own understanding of neocolonialism. I'm looking, the way I choose to understand is not just intellectually through, classic academic analysis or, view. It's also through lived experience. And that's where I focus more of my study. And not just as an intellectual exercise, but so that I can properly locate this in people's lives. So as I practice liberation psychology in the future, once I'm degreed, then my focus will be on doing my part to help people understand how exactly neocolonialism is showing up in their life, how they are being impacted by it, and then helping empower them to stand up against it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I hesitate to put neocolonialism in my own words, only because I'm not exactly sure I would define it properly. But I think that it is sort of exactly what we're seeing happen now, where the U.S. is expanding its empire not by a classical colonial invasion and takeover, but through commerce, through basically capitalist means and base expansion. So there's a book called Base Nation. David Vine, I believe, is who wrote that.
Right.
And in that book, he mentions Little Americas. And that's really what bases are. Especially the ones that house troops and families. They're basically these little United States of America in the middle of countries that don't belong to us, but then we take over their economy.
Mm-hmm.
We move people out of their homes. We basically are enacting settler colonialism in an indirect way, because people will go, sometimes they'll stay, like in Okinawa, there are a lot of expats all over the place who were in these places because they were stationed there. And then they settle there.
Right.
They make businesses, they affect the economy, they affect the environment, they affect policy.
Well, good. I really appreciate all you're saying here, and I'm out of questions, but I would like to throw back to you as like there anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't touched on, or that you would just like to say.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. It was really enjoyable for me, and I think I'd like to leave people with a challenge to really look at, and I do this for myself, so it's a challenge we can do together. Really look at how you're benefiting from capitalism and at whose cost.
Mm-hmm.
At what cost are you having the things that you want? And I feel like that's an important step for us to really place ourselves in the context of our roles in all of this, and then will give us some good information on how to change that.
Thanks very much for coming on the show and talking with me. It's really been a pleasure to spend more time with you. Thanks again to Monisha Rios for joining me this week on Wider View. During this interview, a number of books and a video were mentioned. I'll be adding links to those books and to the video in the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com. Wider View is also available free of charge to radio stations affiliated with the Pacifica Network, and if you have such a radio station in your area, consider asking them to add Wider View to their program schedule. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you may be listening. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.